Welcome to the second episode of Mountain Momma Classical, the podcast where we bring classical Christian education to the hills and hollers of West Virginia. I'm Josiah Batten. I'm the headmaster at Emmanuel Christian School in Clarksburg, and I'm joined by
Kodey, Watkins, Logic and Rhetoric teacher for Emmanuel Christian School. So today we're going to be looking at the question, what is the portrait of the graduate for Emmanuel Christian School? In our last episode, we kind of talked through this idea of backwards planning to get to that portrait of the graduate. So we have the ideal of what it looks like to be a graduate of Emmanuel Christian School,
right,
and then we build up to that.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit more about that today?
Yeah. We summarized our portrait of the graduate with the statement, we aim to graduate students who are good people, useful citizens, and faithful disciples. Now that's a summary. The full portrait of the graduate has about 10 different elements, and they all start with the statement, we aim to graduate students who, and I'll just read them for you. We aim to graduate students who endeavor to know God through his general and special revelation, live all of life in light of the teachings of Jesus Christ and the truth of the gospel, are committed to biblical local churches, love what is good, beautiful, and true, are inspired by the wonder of God's creation to learn with humble excellence, use the love of learning to fulfill the mission of God, live a life of sincere virtue and service, use reason to think and speak well, act for the good of our nation through the constitutional order, uphold truth for the renewal of the home, church, and world. That's our portrait of the graduate. We aim to graduate students who do all of those things.
Yeah, that's really good. I think even your condensed there are 3 points again. Can you say that again?
Good people, useful citizens, and faithful disciples.
Faithful disciples. And really, you can consolidate that down to obedient Christians.
Yeah.
Right? Obedient Christians.
Right.
We seek at Emmanuel. It's all right to have families and kids who are not Christians, but I hope you know that the overflow of our heart and our ministry here is that we would disciple children to know Christ.
Yes.
Right? And not just children, right? But we want the whole family involved.
Right.
So we want everyone to know Christ. And we want people to be obedient to the call of Christ.
Right.
Right. And that trickles into our portrait of the graduate.
That's right.
So how do we get there, right? We talked last episode about backwards planning. If that's the standard,
right.
If that's what we're hoping to when we graduate 12th graders, when they leave Emmanuel, then how do we get there? What's our process from kindergarten up?
Right. So throughout the whole process, we believe that there's knowledge students have to do those things, objective knowledge, and we also believe that there is a formation of the soul, a cultivation of love, and a cultivation of the heart that needs to happen for them to do those things. Right. So from kindergarten up, and we also, we have a junior K, but you can't ever assume that all of your students are going to start in junior K. Right. Some students will only start in kindergarten. Right.
And we have other students who just kind of drop in
the middle,
at any grade, right?
Yeah.
But the ideal that we're talking about here is that you've been with us
the whole time.
Right.
That is the ideal because we have a cohesive and comprehensive curriculum. Right. And if you take a student out in the middle of that, they're going to be yanked into something else that doesn't really line up. And if you drop a student in the middle, we'll work with it, and we do work with it, but they may be missing some things that our students who have been with us the whole time already have. Right. So in kindergarten, by far the biggest focus is on phonics and reading. If a student gets out of kindergarten and they can read, that's a successful kindergarten. Right. Okay? Now, our students do other things in kindergarten. They still start to learn math. They can count. They can skip count up to a certain number. Those things all happen in kindergarten, but really the most crucial thing is that they read. because all of their subsequent learning depends on them being able to read.
Right.
So that's the biggest focus. And reading in the West became popularized because we wanted students and families and people to be able to read the Bible. We were motivated to teach reading in Western civilization on a large scale,
Right.
so people could read the Bible.
Right.
That's what
The
starts.
sole aim
Yeah.
is to know Christ.
Right.
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 We want to teach you to read so you can know Christ.
Yep.
Right. So that's the foundation in kindergarten.
Yeah.
We at least want you to be able to read the Bible.
Right.
And if you can read the Bible, you can probably read a whole bunch
Anything
of other
else.
books. Right.
Yeah. Exactly. So the Bible is the most influential book in the history of the world. Right. If you can read that, you're going to pick up on a lot of allusions to the Bible in other works. You're going to pick up on a lot of things. I know a guy who's really into a particular card game, and I made a reference, swords to plowshares. Okay. And he's like, did you just reference a card? I was like, I referenced Isaiah 2. Yep. That card that you're talking about is also referencing Isaiah 2 because the source is the Bible. Right. So we continue phonics a little bit up through second grade, and by second grade, students are really reading chapter books, shorter chapter books, but chapter books. Right. So by way of example, The Courage of Sarah Noble, that's a really popular one. Now we also, you have math, you have science, you have these other subjects. Right. In the lower school, in the earlier grades, the focus is on grammar. So you learn to read, you begin to learn a lot about the language, right. And not just the language of English. Yes, English itself, but also the language of science. What are the basic facts you need to know and understand science? What are the basic facts you need to know and understand history? Kids at this age are good at memorization, so we lean into that. We memorize things like the presidents. We memorize the states and capitals. We memorize those things so that when they get to logic school and they start to ask, why was George Washington the first person elected president of the United States? They already have that basic foundation of George Washington was the first president.
Right. Right. It's not new information.
It's not new information, right? They have that, so now they can ask the higher question of why.
Right.
Right?
Because logic and rhetoric is building on the foundation of what they've already done.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So E.D. Hirsch wrote books about this, arguing that there's what we call cultural literacy. There are things you just need to understand to be able to read, and not read just phonetically, right. But also to read and catch a reference or catch someone alluding to something else. If there's a reference to flying monkeys, you understand that that's a reference to The Wizard of Oz.
Right. I think about G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. You can't read that unless, I don't know if he intentionally did this, but it's like every other line there's a reference to something.
Yes.
Whether it's like a philosopher of the day,
yeah.
Or like somewhere around him.
Yeah.
So unless you're widely known about Chesterton's time,
yeah.
Reading that book is going to be very difficult.
Right.
I found it difficult as I'm reading through it. And I've got the version by Trevin Wax, who has the annotations.
Yeah.
He's like, and this is who this is, and
right.
this is who this is.
Right.
Right. But that's what you're talking about, like that cultural literacy, mm-hmm. Understanding more than just George Washington was the first president, right? But by the time we get to logic and rhetoric school, we want to be able to expand on that, right? We want to be able to know more about what's going on there.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's how it all starts, and then as it continues, we've kind of alluded to it already, but as it continues and students continue to grow, right? And this is, in a sense, this all really reflects human nature and the students' nature as they grow and as they grow older and their capacities develop. Right. They start to ask those why questions. They become a little more argumentative, and we lean into that and we teach them logic. And you teach logic not just because students become argumentative, but because if you don't shape a student who's becoming argumentative to learn that arguments are for the discovery of truth. Right. They're not there to beat your opponent up. truth is not there as a bludgeon
Right.
against your opponent. You argue not just because it's fun to argue. You argue to discover truth.
Right.
If you're going to form the soul, you have to do it then,
Right.
so that students throughout their whole life recognize, when I come to assess an argument, my goal is to discover truth. It's not to dunk on my opponent. It's not to bludgeon someone. It's to discover truth.
Right.
We're orienting the soul toward the good and true and beautiful.
Right. And even thinking about that, it comes back down to our portrait of the graduate. We want them to be Christian.
Yes.
Right. Which means even one of our school rules, the law of God is treat others how you want to be treated. Right. Is that the principle of reciprocity? Like to treat others
Right.
as you want to be treated. So if you're sitting there and you're having a conversation with someone, and you just continue to talk over them, and not listening to anything you're saying, you're having a one-sided argument.
Yep.
And if you expect to be treated the way you are treating others, it's like that same thing is going to happen to you.
Yep.
Right? So there's no dialogue happening. There's no conversation. Nothing is actually getting done in that conversation. So teaching logic as to be respectful, right? To be able to wield truth appropriately with the right demeanor is super important as well as we're building our way up to the portrait of the graduate.
Yeah.
I think that's super important as
Yep.
well.
Yeah, we want our students to know things,
Right.
and we want those students to be able to take what they know and apply it
Right.
in all of life. And we want all of those things they know to be oriented themselves around the Bible.
Right. Yeah. And I think that as we're moving up from grammar is the foundation, right? We teach them to read so that they can read the Bible, so that they can know Christ, so that they can interact with all these other subjects that point towards Christ.
Yep.
Logic then is getting into the critical thinking of all these other subjects, right? And then there's that hierarchy of how grammar, logic, rhetoric then lead to theology of knowing God, right? Then rhetoric is being able to communicate that.
Yeah.
Like, so our graduate should be able to communicate, maybe not everything they've learned since kindergarten,
Right.
But a specific set of information, right? And what would that be?
So that specific set of information would be the canon of the West.
Right.
That would be the great books and those liberal arts that we teach as subjects. So, there's geography. Students need to be able to know where Ethiopia is.
Right.
If they're going to read in Acts that Philip encountered an Ethiopian eunuch.
Right.
Yeah. They also need to know where Russia is if they're going to hear on the news that Russia is at war with Ukraine.
Right.
They need to know those things. So there's that core of essential knowledge, what Hirsch called cultural literacy. We study that through the great books. Mm-hmm. Where are the most important things that we know as a civilization? They're in the great books. Right. Where are the references? Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Shakespeare. So we read Shakespeare. We don't read about Shakespeare, we read Shakespeare. Right. Even The Wizard of Oz, which we referenced, that's the first American fairy story. Okay? Well, what is a fairy story? If you know what a fairy story is, you can understand why The Wizard of Oz is the first American fairy story.
And I think as well, it's good, like in our classical studies, we're reading, or we just finished up the Aeneid, which is Virgil, who was about 70 years before Christ. And he's writing with a specific purpose, right? He's writing this grand epic for the purpose of, one, demonstrating the ideal Roman citizen. So when a Roman citizen would read this book, they would be encouraged, and they would. It's like seeking after, like my life should look like that, right? So we read the Aeneid not to be a Roman citizen, but to be a citizen of the West, right? Who knows Christ, right? So we might read about the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon and all that sort of stuff, but we're forming all this stuff, funneling it, all of it to its proper place to show us how Christ makes us the proper citizen, right? The citizen of the kingdom of heaven, right?
Right. And ideally, you want students to experience all of that.
Right.
But in the 12 years, 13 years that we have a student, you can't give them every experience they need to form all of that character.
Right.
You can't. So what do? What's the shortcut? What's the shortcut to that character and that virtue? It's examples.
Right.
And where do you learn those examples? Literature. Right. The great books, the Bible. This is where you learn character. You can't visit every country in the world.
Right.
But you can visit every country in the world in your mind if you read about it, if you study it, if you learn its location, you learn its culture, you learn about its languages and their economy. You can do that in 13 years. Right. You can't necessarily visit every country in the world in 13 years unless you're extraordinarily wealthy.
Exactly. So we seek here then, wrapping up here, because we're going a little long, wrapping up here, we seek the portrait of the graduate, which, if you could, again, those the summary of it, to be a good person, the second, third,
useful citizen, and a faithful disciple. And we do that by teaching the kids how to read, right, and to love reading in grammar school, teaching them to argue well, and think critically in logic school, and then teaching them to communicate well, right? That's not all we do, but those are the core steps in each one of those in grammar, logic, and rhetoric school. So that's a good summary of what we just talked about over the last 16 minutes. Anything else you want to say? No, you do all that, you can learn anything.
There we go. All right. Well, hey, thanks for having us. This has been Mountain Momma Classical.